Hi, I'm Nancy Rathbun from Completely Quilted. Thank you for purchasing our Be Merry 6-month block of the month. So today I'm going to show you what's going to come in your first kit and how we put it together. So in your first month, you're going to be receiving a color picture of the finished quilt and your pattern for the country church. So that's the first block that we're going to make. You're also going to be getting a little key for every block that you're going to receive. So this month there's only one block, and that's the church. And on the key it shows all the sizes of the fabric that you're going to be getting. The fabric is going to be folded up all together, and each piece is labeled. So you can see all of your pieces have little labels of what part they're going to be used in your pattern. So go ahead and get your patterns out and ready to follow me along and your fabric pieces, and we'll create the country church. So your church block is going to have 3 sections. It's going to have a steeple section, it's going to have a roof section, and then the church section. So this first part is the steeple section here. So one technique that you're going to use to create the steeple is you're going to have your steeple rectangle fabric, and you're going to have 2 little squares. So these squares are going to be sewn on the diagonal. So you can see here I've marked one of my squares from corner to corner. You'll need to mark both of these, and I'm going to be using my Frixion gel pens. They look like an ink pen, and they are, but then they just magically iron away. So I'm going to mark from corner to corner on both of my small squares, and I'm going to position this square right on top of my steeple rectangle fabric. So I'm going to sew right on this marked line from corner to corner to create the point of my steeple. So I'm going to take this over to my sewing machine, and I'm going to sew right on this line here. So now that we've sewn on that marked line, we're going to trim away the excess fabric. And I just cut a 1/4 of an inch seam allowance, and then that fabric gets pressed away from my steeple. So my next piece is going to be layered and sewn on the opposite corner. And you'll see that you're going to sew and overlap a little bit of that blue background fabric. So I'm going to take this over to my sewing machine, and I'm going to stitch on this marked line as well. Both of my pieces sewn, and I'm going to cut the excess away from underneath that second triangle section. And now I have the point of my steeple, and I should, if I've done it right, have a 1/4 of an inch from the point to the top of my steeple, and that's going to give me my nice 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. So I have my steeple section done here. And the next steps are just sewing your large background squares and a small square on top of the steeple to create this top section. So the second segment we're going to sew is the roof section. So you're going to have 2 background squares, and you're going to sew 2 steeple strips onto either side. Okay? So it's important to note that these are going to be opposites. So we're going to have mirror images for each side of our roof. So I've already sewn these with a 1/4 of an inch seam on either side of my background. And now I'm going to take my roof section. Okay? And I've already marked all of my squares from corner to corner because that's where we're going to be sewing these sections. So my first roof section, I'm going to position and center it with the corner right on the corner of our steeple fabric. So this background piece over here is going to be not going to be sewn, but it's okay that it's not the same size. It's going to be even with this corner here. And then our other roof section, if you look at it positioned like this in front of you, you can see that those angles here are going to make up the angles of our roof. So I'm going to take this over to my sewing machine and I'm going to sew right on those lines. And I'm going to do them at the same time so that I know that I'm going to keep those mirror images that I have in front of me now. So I'm using my Bernina number 37 presser foot, and I'm sewing just right on that marked line. And then I'm just going to take my next piece and I'm going to sew that as well. So now that we've pressed our roof section, okay, we're ready to add the church triangle. This also is going to be positioned on top of these sections here. We're going to sew on this diagonal line again, and let me just show you, I'm just going to fold it to show you how this is going to look when we're done sewing. When we're done sewing, we're going to fold this again towards me, and you can see that what you're left with is the roof of the church, and then just a small strip of the roof, and then the tiny piece of the steeple poking up from underneath. So position that corner on the bottom here, and not this top section up here. So we position those, and I'm going to sew from corner to corner, and then I'm going to trim that excess. So we're going to sew again from corner to corner on that line that we marked. Here are our two nice finished little roof sections. You can see our little steeple from behind, our small strips that we ended up of the roof fabric, and then our church fabric. And then underneath that, what you have is you have all of these layers that you don't need. So those are going to be trimmed off, and I'm just going to use my scissors, trim out that excess with 1/4 inch seam allowance, not too close, and that's going to reduce that bulk of that fabric from behind your block. So I'm going to go ahead and trim this one as well. So I'm going to complete this roof section by sewing these two pieces together, right sides together. And I want to make sure that my steeple section and my roof section stay even right up here at the there is our roof section completed. We're going to do some applique on this in another step, and I'm going to show you the church section. So we've just completed our roof section, and now we're ready to sew our church section. So the church section is made up of the windows and the doors of the church. So the first part you're going to sew is the church section windows. I've already sewn these. This is going to be the same method that we sewed our steeple section together in the first step. So you're going to have two window sections with their tops, and then you're going to sew some squares onto the bottom of the window sections. So I'm going to set those aside, and I'm going to show you how we're going to do the door section. Okay? So the door has a curved window on the top of it, and that's created by doing some applique. So you're going to take your pattern, and you'll need an optional tool, which is steam-a-seam. So the steam-a-seam has a fusible webbing on the back side, and the top is just a protective paper. So I like to use a Sharpie marking pen, and you'll need to mark what sections you'll need for your applique. So on my pattern, I have this oval window over the door, and it's made up of 3 sections. These 2 accents on the top, and then this bottom accent underneath. So when I trace these in 3 separate pieces. So I'm going to go ahead and just trace the accent over the door first, and I'm tracing it on the paper side of my fusible. So that's one section. And then completely separate from that, I'm going to trace my second window section, the other side of that window accent. And then that third section, that's going to be the over the door section. So this is going to be underneath our top window accent pieces. So I'm tracing that as well. When we cut these out, we have to leave about 1/4 of an inch on the outside, because we're going to iron this down and then cut it out again. So I'm going to cut out all of my pieces, leaving that 1/4 of an inch section for fusing. And then we're going to fuse these sections to the wrong side of our applique fabrics. So this yellow here, this is our window fabric, and I'm going to iron this underneath accent, and then we'll also have another window that's going to be out of the window fabric as well. And then we're going to have the window accent pieces, which are those kind of leaf-shaped pieces that I traced before, and these will be used on top of the circle. So I'm going to press these with my iron, with the paper side still up, and then we're going to cut these out right on the line that I traced. Those will be cut right on the line for our window accent pieces. So after we've cut these sections out, then you just peel away that protective back paper, and that leaves us with a sticky side that we can iron down for over our door. So I'm going to go ahead and iron and cut out these other pieces, and then I'll be ready to show you how to applique them together. Now we're ready to do some applique. So I have my Bernina sewing machine set up with my number 20 open embroidery foot, and I'm using isocord thread. You just want to use a thread that's going to match your fabrics. That's going to make your applique look really nice. I'm using a blanket stitch, and I'm going to move my needle position all the way to the right so that my applique is going to be right on the edge of my fabric. So this is the door section, the over the door section of my church. And I have my window fabric underneath, and then those two blue accents, and they're all ironed in place so they're not going to shift when I'm doing my applique. And so since there's no raw edges on my yellow, all I need is my blue thread for this section here. So I'm going to position my fabric underneath my presser foot, and I'm just going to start stitching slowly. And I'm going to go all the way around these blue sections. Stop with my needle down in the corner, and I'm just going to pivot on that needle and keep sewing all the way around until I've finished all of those raw edges. So now we're ready to sew our church section together. So we have all of our pieces in place. We're going to have a series of rectangles that are sewn together. So if you look here in the center, I have my door section, and we have strips of the background church fabric, and then we have our window units, and then on the outside we're going to have our background fabrics. So I'm going to sew all of these rows together with 1/4 inch seam allowance, and if you look at your pattern, you'll see that there are diagrams showing you which ways to press all of these strips so it lays nice and flat. We've sewn our 3 separate sections together, and I'm going to show you some additional applique that I went ahead and sewed for our steeple section, our roof, and our church building section. So we have our steeple section here, and I went ahead and I added the cross applique, and then the steeple applique, which is from the background fabric. And then I went ahead and I sewed a triple straight stitch. You could also hand embroider this, a little rope for your bells. And I also appliqued my 3 bells to the steeple. And then on my roof section, I appliqued the window, the circle window, and the window accents for a little stained glass window on my roof. And then I'd already showed the applique for the window above the door on the church section, but I also sewed our ground strip onto the bottom. So now to complete the block, we're going to sew these 3 sections together with 1/4 inch seam allowance, and we'll show you the finished block. So now we've completed our finished church block. We've got our ground fabric sewn on to our church section with our applique we did above the door. We've got our roof section with our appliqued window, and then our steeple section with our bells and our applique and the cross. I'm Nancy Rathbun. Thank you for watching our demonstration on month 1 of our Be Merry block of the month. Be sure to watch our month 2 block of the month instructional video. Thank you for purchasing our kit.